Hi everyone, I'm Ira, and I host the 101 podcast, which is where the world's leaders and innovators come to share their life lessons, their drive, and visions for our future. In the first episode of the 101 podcast, we will be talking to Professor John Hennessy, who is chairman of Alphabet, former president of Stanford University, and Turing Award recipient. Today we'll be talking about creating world leaders, the past, present, and future of Silicon Valley, lessons from managing world-leading organizations, and designing ethical standards in parallel with new technologies. Professor Hennessy, thank you so much for being with us today. First off, we want to start off with asking you, a lot of you students have gone to develop technologies and founded companies like Google and Yahoo and become world-changing people. What do you see in them, and what can we learn from them?
That's a great question. I think one of the things we certainly see in them is curiosity about what a new technology might do, what it might develop, a willingness to think about things differently. And when Jerry and Dave were graduate students and built what became Yahoo, they were motivated by the World Wide Web was exploding, and they wanted ways to organize and share interesting sites on the web that they discovered or their friends discovered. And I think that was the motivation. It was the beginning of seeing that. In fact, I remember they gave me a demo, and they showed me that the local pizza parlor would now allow you to order online, not just see their menu, but actually order online. This was 25 years ago, 30 years ago. When I saw that, I realized that the web was going to change the way we do so many different things, the way we buy things, the way we interact with restaurants and businesses and others. And so that early work was really critical in creating that transformation.
Wow, thank you so much. It's amazing how you've been able to identify characteristics in your students from very early on, and that leads me to the next question. So, what would you say are the characteristics that you want to see in the next influential leader?
Well, certainly, I think this willingness to approach problems differently and to think differently about things. Mm-hmm. To think in a positive fashion about what we can do to address many of the challenges we have, whether they are inequality or issues of poverty around the world, or climate change, of course, a global problem that everybody's has to worry about. Mm-hmm. So I think a passion for making a positive contribution to the world, together with that intellectual curiosity, drive, in the end, if you want to get something done, you have to be willing to put the shoulder to the grindstone and really work hard on things. So that drive to make a difference. And sometimes vision's very important. Early on in the early days of Google, I went down to visit Larry and Sergey, and they said, tell us what's your goal? What's your mission? And they said, well, to organize all the world's information and make it useful for people. So that was a great big vision that could take the company a long way, and the founders could play a key role in developing it.
Mm-hmm. So you would say vision, a need to improve the world, and also a certain drive.
Yep.
To
those are important
bring
things
to success. Well, those are really important factors. And leading to the next question, you've also been president of Stanford. You were part of leading a really well-regarded institution that teaches people to become leaders in policy, entrepreneurship, and technology in the future. Where do you think the world is headed, and what kind of education system do you envision?
Well, I wish I could tell you I thought the world was headed in a good direction. The world is headed in what seems to be a more difficult direction, especially this week, and global strife continues. Things which we thought were not ever going to occur again have occurred. So I think we still have a void in terms of the quality of leadership that we have around the world. Mm-hmm. If you look at the progress we're making on climate change, we're moving way too slowly. And unfortunately, the damage from climate change is going to affect some of the poorest countries of the world and the people that were most endangered. Not because of what they did, but because of the actions that we didn't take in parts of the developed world. So I feel like we really need better leadership that's ethical, obviously, that's visionary, that's willing to try to inspire people. And certainly that's one of the things, those are things we try to cultivate among our students.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. One other question. So if you could design a system to teach kindergartners today to be leaders of tomorrow, what?
Well, start them early, right? I guess that's right. I mean, certainly some of the things you learn in kindergarten are really important, right? There are things about sharing and the golden rule and things about how you interact with others that I think are the foundation. I think of those ethical principles, those elements of good character as a foundation. And on that you can build the skills then to become a better leader. But you need that ethical foundation. Without that ethical foundation, you will be faced with difficult situations in which you will not have a guiding star to help you make the right decision.
That is so important, because along with building the hard skills and the talent, it is also really important to build that foundation that allows people to live in a world and be able to, interact with each other. We've touched a bit about ethical standards, and we'll come back to this later on. I really want to know, you starting off as a researcher, what were your motivations in being a researcher and continuing in that field?
Well, I started as a researcher, as you said, and I started because I loved research. I loved understanding how technology might play out, what new things might be done, what new frontiers might be attacked, might be overcome, what challenges might be overcome. So, and the joy of being involved in a research program where you're discovering new things, where you're trying new ideas out, and you're working typically with graduate students or other faculty. I think it's a very exciting, innovative way to live your life, and so for me that was a great time. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. So you yourself is a researcher, and you've worked with a lot of researchers in the field. So what do you think drives a great researcher?
What drives a great researcher is the interest in doing work that really contributes to the field. We used to say sometimes, we aspire to do the work that other people in the field need to know about and use in order to advance. So we desire to do work that really is transformative, is foundational, so that, and it can be, the nice thing about that definition is it works very well for very theoretical work, where other theoreticians may build on your work, but it also works for practical work, where people in industry may use your results and immediately change what's going on in the field.
Right. And leading on to identifying work that will be that will have implications in the real world. You've done a really world-breaking research on the risk architecture. So before we dive deeper into how you did it, can you explain briefly about what is risk architecture to a high schooler?
Sure. So a good way to think about this is, think about a book that's written with very long sentences, using very big words that you might not know. That's a hard book to read. You read a few words and then you have to pick up the dictionary and look up something. You have a hard time figuring out the sentence structure because it's very complicated. That's the way computers were being built before we did our risk work. It's an idea called CISC, complex instruction set. That's the way computers were being built. We said, well, what if we build them using simple words simple sentence structures. A reader, you could read that much faster than you could read the one with the big complicated words that you didn't know. So that was the idea. The language that we used to communicate programs was simpler, therefore it could be digested by the hardware, by the computer itself, faster than the one with more complicated instructions, more complicated language.
Right, and you mentioned that CISC was the more popular, how computers worked back then. What made you believe in RISC and work on it while the world was working on?
Yeah, we didn't initially know that it would be better. What happened was, in that time frame, there was a switch from computers being big things sitting in racks to computers fitting on single chips that could be in a laptop or a phone. And that switch was just occurring, was just happening. And we said, well, this CISC method has been developed for these big machines that work this way. But if we're going to have just a single chip microprocessor, maybe the architecture should be different. And that was the beginning, just that simple question. Let's relook at it and see what makes sense. And we quickly concluded that simplifying it would have a lot of advantages. It would actually simplify some of the software. It would make the hardware faster. So then we were pretty certain, we had our university results, and we were pretty certain this method was going to work a lot better, like 3 or 4 times better. And but not everybody believed it. Thank goodness my colleague up at Berkeley, Dave Patterson, had a similar project, because I think had there been only one project with this crazy idea, which people thought it was crazy. They thought we were crazy. They thought we didn't know what we're talking about. Wow. In fact, there was one incident. We're on a debate. We're on a panel. And I was on it. My colleague at Berkeley, Dave Patterson, was on it. And then there were 2 anti-risk people who didn't believe in our idea. And one of them was from then the largest computer company in the world, IBM. And somebody said to him, well, to this other person who was the antagonist, you've just said these ideas aren't going to work, and Hennessy just got $1 million to start a company to try to prove they work. But you're saying they're not working. What should he do? And he said, take the money and run away to South America. So we didn't do that. It turned out the ideas did work out, and in the end, but it took time. Great technical ideas sometimes take time and maturation. But once the tablets and phones came along, the answer was clear. It was just a much better approach.
Wow, that's amazing how you just have so much resilience to wait for time to come.
Yeah. Well, we kept working on it, but it did take time. It did take time. Yeah.
Wow, that's amazing. And so you talked about your people who countered you, and you had to work with the technology that you believed in, until you found that there was potential in the technology. And you also founded the MIPS Computer Systems, which is a company. And to that point, in bringing something in research to market, how did you transfer technology from university to the real world?
Yeah, so I think we certainly we had some of our graduate students came with us and joined the company as well. That was really important because they had the ideas in their heads. And I always say, you don't really transfer technology, you transfer people. People are the key ingredient. We did purchase some software from Stanford, license some software from Stanford as part of the project. But mostly we had the concepts of what to do and how to do it, and that was those were the really important insights. And initially, I'll tell you that we wrote our scientific papers. We thought, this is such an obviously great idea. People will pick it up. But as I said, there were a lot of disbelievers And finally, a famous computer pioneer came to me and said, if you really believe in this idea, you have to start a company. Because this technology is too disruptive and obsoletes too many existing products. These companies are going to be reluctant to do it because of that. And that was part of what convinced us to do it, to start the company and try to demonstrate the ideas would really work in practice.
So at that time, like, you knew it would work, but you started it in order to show that it...
Well, we knew in the sense that, think about a glass that's half full, right? We knew we could fill up the rest of that glass. Other people thought that glass is only half full, that technology is not going to work. But you need to, what we had built was very much a university prototype. It was not a product. It was in fact, the company ended up rebuilding everything. But they used the key insights and ideas that were there and just built everything from scratch. And that's typical. You've got to figure out sometimes what you get from in the case of Google, for example, what the university licensed to the company was actually the first search engine. But it got replaced after about a year or two by a new implementation. And often things that get transferred from the university, Yahoo, they rebuilt it. They just rebuilt Yahoo. So sometimes you rebuild it and you take the concepts rather than the actual artifacts that were created at the university.
Right. So things that were created in academia have to be kind of like reshaped to fit into the real world.
They have to be turned into real engineering products, not because they're prototypes. Universities build prototypes. They don't build products, right? So.
Yes, definitely. And you also mentioned about, finding the right people, the right team of people to start something new. So I was wondering, I listened to some of your talks, and you talk about creating an environment of people, no matter in Stanford or in your organizations. And even in Stanford, you worked to bridge interdisciplinary research between humanities, arts, sciences. Why do you think that is important in a world where it's so technologically different?
I think it's important because the real hard problems we have to solve are not standalone problems that are going to be solved by somebody focusing in a narrow field. They inevitably require other disciplines and other things. I think about climate change we mentioned earlier. You're not going to... Yes, technology is part of the solution. Absolutely, technology is part of the solution. Better batteries, new ways to generate renewables, better solar cells, all part of the solution. But you're not going to solve the problem fast enough with just technology. So you need policy. You need to do a better job of communicating the risks and the dangers of what's happening in climate change so that you can get governmental policy, society behind what has to be done. And that's a good demonstration because now you're talking about fields, well, you're talking about law because you've got to write new laws. You're talking about people who do communications. You're talking about people who think about sociology and political science, and as well as, of course, the technological fields.
Yeah, that's really interesting because when you're working to push technology into the world, you're really you're just trying to work with people. And in order to work with people, you need people who understand people.
Right, you need people skills.
That's really great. And moving on to one quote that I heard, I think Mark Andreessen said
Mark
this.
Andreessen.
Yeah. So he said, "You're the godfather of
I know,
Silicon
Mark's
Valley."
very generous.
And I was sitting and wondering, what would the godfather of Silicon Valley do if he was 18 right now, starting his time at university, in seeing so much future, and like, what would you be most interested in studying and why?
Well, for me, studying computer science is very natural because it's a field I know that I love, and my ways of thinking are aligned with the kind of thinking you need to do in the computing field. And I think it's a very exciting time with the explosion of machine learning and AI, which despite everything that's happened in the last decade, which is truly amazing, more progress in the last decade than we had in the probably 20 or 30 years before. We are just at the beginning of this process of this revolution. So the temptation to work on that area would be overwhelming. But several times I thought, if I was going to come back, I'd love to come back in personalized medicine, genetics, these fields as well, because I think they also are ones that, if you look at the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, using mRNA technology, it's truly amazing that they were able to develop a vaccine and get it out in a year, when typically vaccine development takes 7 to 10 years. So I think there are exciting things happening in these fields as well. And to see people really thinking differently about how we're going to solve these problems. And of course, the energy problem, renewable energy problem. There are so many terrific areas in which young people can work now, I think, where technology is an important part of it, but there's more than that. It's broader. You need to think, particularly for these technologies which are going to deeply affect society, you need to think more broadly about those kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Right, so it would still be, the future would still be something related to computer science, related to technology.
For me, but that's because it's a field that fits very well. When I think a lot of students have this deja vu as they go through their studies and start thinking about what they want to major, and all of a sudden they find something that A, they love doing, and B, they can do well. And I think those two go together. I've never met anybody who achieved at the highest level but didn't love the field they were in. Because it's hard there's a lot of competition in the world. If you want to achieve at the highest level, you better love it, because if you don't love it, you're not going to be able to do it with the energy and enthusiasm that you need to really be a leader in that field.
Mm-hmm. Right. This also brings me to the question, there's a lot of talk about being a software engineer or a computer scientist. So what do you think are the differences between them, and what do each of them contribute to the world?
Well, I don't know if I don't know how much difference there is. Computer science is a discipline. Software engineers are people who write software using computer science as their underlying discipline. So, of course, there are computer scientists who do things other than write software. There are computer science. I'm a computer scientist. My colleague Dave Patterson's a computer scientist. We both design hardware, so there are kind of different ways to think about it. Computer science is a field that has evolved and grown so much over the 60 years or so that it's been a separate, identifiable field. When I was young, when I was your age, the field was quite small still. It was still the infancy of the field. By comparison now, just the range of the field and the scale of it has just changed dramatically over time.
And that also, so would you say it developed during the same time that Silicon Valley started? And
when I arrived, Silicon Valley, it was called Silicon Valley because they made silicon. There were no computer companies. There was no Apple yet when I arrived here at Stanford. There were no computer companies. HP was getting ready to do some computers for laboratory kinds of functions and control. But they were primarily an instrumentation company, building medical and electronic instrumentation. So the field really changed over time. First it began to build up hardware and networking businesses, then software businesses, and then, of course, businesses that use the World Wide Web as their primary place where they make contributions.
So it was hardware and then shifted to software. What do you think? I'm sure a lot of people have asked you this, but what do you think is the next promising?
That's a really good question. Well, I think the AI revolution still has a long ways to go. The challenge we're going to face at some point is to find a general purpose replacement for silicon. So the thing to understand about the computer industry is it's ridden on the back of the integrated circuit industry. So Why have computers gotten so much cheaper, so much more effective? It's because the underlying hardware has gotten so much faster and cheaper. As that comes to an end with the end of Moore's Law and begins to slow down, how we're going to achieve that next generation of breakthroughs is going to be challenging, much harder than it's been in the past. And for some applications, we probably do have some good insight for machine learning applications, very large scale, time intensive applications. But for other things, it's going to be harder to find a path forward. And somebody's going to have to invent some new technology to really take us forward if we're going to continue to make progress.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting. Really want to know what's going to be next.
Yeah, very hard to predict what's going to be next. Very hard to predict. There's a famous quote by Yogi Berra, the New York Yankees catcher. Mm-hmm. He said, "It's very hard to make predictions, especially about the future."
Definitely. And you've talked a lot about, being a researcher, and also you've also had experience leading, one of the world's leading companies, Google, Alphabet. So what do you think is like the key to leading successful organizations?
Well, I think that any successful organization starts with having great people, mm-hmm. because no leader can possibly even get close to doing everything that needs to be done. So they have to surround themselves with other great people who will complement and be able to amplify the contribution that individual can make. So it begins with great people, a vision of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to accomplish, and then a drive to really get there and to make the kinds of decisions that will push you in the direction you want to go. So there's a focus on things, in a university, for example. Mm-hmm. There's a focus on things like excellence, making world impactful contributions by picking fields that really are going to have significant impact on the human condition. Mm-hmm. So those things kind of go together, and you then think about how to structure the university and to ensure that you're getting the very best. It's why in universities, people often, they look at the picture of the university and they see all these beautiful buildings. And it's true, Stanford has beautiful buildings, right? The main quad is gorgeous. But universities are not about buildings. They're about the people. They're about that coming together of students and faculty, and the top students and top faculty who together will make new discoveries and find new knowledge. And that's what will change the world.
Mm-hmm. So you would say that it's the combination of not only like experts in the field, but also like fresh new ideas that come together.
Sure. I mean, if you think about Larry Page and Sergey Brin, there were search engines out there. There were other search engines. They just made a decision that they could build one that was better, and started and discovered that, in fact, they could. They came up with an algorithm that was much better than what existed before. So that approach is critical. And I think, in my career, I've worked very closely with probably 40 PhD students over my career that made really important contributions to the field and advancing it.
Mm-hmm. That is amazing. And other than like trying to create like the perfect team, can you describe like a time when an organization you were leading was facing major challenges, and how did you solve them?
Sure. Well, in the 2008 financial crisis, I was president of the university. During the time of the financial crisis, roughly 9 months from the beginning till about a year till it hit bottom, something like that. But in the first 6 months or so, the university lost almost 30% of its endowment. At that time, about $7 billion was lost in the markets. That created a tremendous amount of financial strain on the university, because that $7 billion would generate about $350 $million a year, and let's see, 7 billion is 7 times. Yeah, about $350 million of income a year that the university was using to support students, to pay faculty, to pay staff. So there was a giant financial hole, and we had to decide what could we do to close that financial hole and try to move the university forward. And we decided that we wouldn't, because of the stress of the time, we didn't want to cut student financial aid or anything, or get rid of any faculty. But we did need to make some cuts, so we made some cuts across the university. All the senior leadership took a salary reduction in order to help close the gap. And we had no raises for a year, we had no new hires for a year. But we managed to hold things together through that year. And then as things began to turn around, we could restore the university back to looking forward and continuing on its journey.
Wow, that sounds like something that comes with experience and with a lot of cases before you can come to that. So I was wondering, so you were a researcher and then you became a managerial person, took on more managerial roles. How did you learn to be a good manager throughout the years?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think leadership, learning any of these things, how to lead something, is a process where you learn step by step. And for me, those steps involved some harder things I had to deal with when I was when I was in a lower level position, like a department chair, a vital position at the university, but we had challenges then, or dean. And what I learned in Silicon Valley. I mean, I learned how to deal with financial crisis in Silicon Valley when my company almost went out of business. And that taught me some things about how to act in a financial crisis. Act quickly, try to get through the crisis and get to the other side as quickly as possible. So I learned those things along the way. You can't, because these leadership situations at the top of any large organization will put you in difficult positions where you're going to have to make difficult decisions that are going to affect people. You have to learn how to make those in a way that's empathetic and as humane as possible. But you have to learn how to make them. And so you learn step by step how to do them as the crises get bigger and bigger, so that you've walked up a ladder, so to speak, and learn how to deal with those kinds of issues.
So it would be like learning by just like experience.
Learning by doing.
All these.
And reading. I'm a big consumer of history and biography, so whenever I can learn from somebody else's mistake, I prefer that over making the mistake myself.
What are some of your favorite books then?
Abraham Lincoln is sort of my personal hero, because he led this country through its great crisis of the Civil War, ended slavery, and did it under extremely difficult circumstances. So he's certainly somebody I look to. But I look also to other global leaders, to what a Nelson Mandela was able to do in South Africa, or a Gandhi was able to do in India. Where did these people get the fortitude and the energy to prosper under such difficult circumstances, and yet to keep their eye, as it says, eyes on the prize. Keep your North Star in sight and keep driving towards it, so that and just continue to make, even when things are challenging, if you can continue to make progress, you can get to the point you want to get to.
Thank you so much, Professor, for sharing that. And from leading all these organizations and bringing technologies into the real world, I'm just curious, as someone who consumes these technologies, how do you, as a leader, evaluate the consequences of technologies that go into the world, and how do you create these frameworks to along with these new technologies?
Yeah, I think the interesting change that occurred in the computer industry many years ago when I started, most of the computers we built were used by other engineers or scientists, not broadly by society. Even the early days of the PC, spreadsheets, word processing, nothing like today, the World Wide Web or social media or anything like that. Those technologies took off so fast that I don't think we had fully contemplated the impact of them on things like civil society and discourse and elections and fake news. And these were all problems which I think, at least the scale of them, caught people by surprise. There was people who recognized that this could exist based on what had happened on cable TV news, for example, which had already, you had Fox News and you had MSNBC, and those were like you were listening to two different versions of the news, right? So there were people who predicted this could occur in social media, and it has occurred. What I think nobody saw was how quickly and how broadly these things could dissipate, so that a piece of fake news could travel so quickly. One of the things we saw this, a horrible situation when there was the mass shooting in New Zealand about 2 years ago. People put the video up on YouTube. YouTube would take it down. People tried to put it up more than 100,000 times. People tried to upload the video. And they kept taking it down. So this just shows that we not only have a technology problem, we have a problem in human society thinking about how we relate to one another and how we treat one another that we also have to work on.
Wow, and do these things get kind of developed or fixed as problems occur, or are these frameworks developed before technology?
Well, they're not always developed before. There's an attempt to do this now around AI, because I think everybody realizes that artificial intelligence has the potential to do both great good as well as harm. So in the case of AI, there is really now an active effort to scope out ethical guidelines for the technology. But it didn't happen in social media. And I think we have not reckoned with some of the negative consequences of social media.
Right. So moving on from social media, there's a lot of talk now. I'm sure you've heard a lot about the metaverse and the also social implications of the metaverse. So if you were a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old who can do anything at all in the metaverse, what are the boundaries of that? Like, how does the metaverse in the future affect society?
Well, I hope responsible parents are not going to let their 5-year-olds spend their entire time on the metaverse, because that's just like letting your 5-year-old, in my generation, letting your 5-year-old spend all their time watching TV. It's not a healthy way to grow or to interact. I think technology, if we extrapolate from what we know about social media and existing technologies to a metaverse kind of environment, what we can say is that some use of technology actually is beneficial. It allows you to interact with people who you might not otherwise ever have a chance to interact with. But replacing real world interactions completely with these artificial interactions, whether it be on social media or in a metaverse, is unhealthy. And so we're going to have to find ways to ensure that people have healthy experiences and not unhealthy experiences. And I think for some people, you can imagine a VR, AR experience being so compelling that they find it more attractive than real life. That will be a very difficult issue, because I think that will lead to situations where we have instability, potential problems. There are a lot of issues that can come out of this. So I think we've got a lot of work to do to ensure that technology is used for good rather than bad.
Yeah, and that brings me to the question. So technology is like rapidly developing, and there's people that want to build the future of the world. And I was wondering whether there are also people trying to to imagine what they want people to be like in the future. And how does that run in parallel with those people trying to just build the next big thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah.
The real question of whether or not people are thinking adequately about the technologies they're developing, and again, whether or not they contribute to a healthy human development as opposed to possibly negative human development. I suspect that a lot more thought has to go into this. If anything, I mean, what can we conclude about looking at the last 10 years of social media? We can conclude we didn't do enough to deal with issues like fake news, fringe groups which act as echo chambers and have confirmational bias in them because the community inside is uniform and homogenous and perhaps quite different from mainstream people. So if we didn't do enough there, shouldn't we be thinking more carefully about this technology before we take it into a new realm like the metaverse? Yes, we should be.
Right. So that's something that would be great for the next computer scientists and people working in the field right now to work on while they're developing these technologies.
Agreed.
We've discussed a lot about your personal experiences in work, in the future of technology. I also want to ask you about, your personal experiences and also things like, so what mattered to you most 30 years ago, 10 years ago, and now? How has it changed?
So what mattered, I think through all those years, obviously things like family and friends have mattered through all those years. Who the family and friends are have changed. I mean, 30 years ago we were raising our children. 10 years ago we were seeing them off into the world, and now we have grandchildren. So we kind of have a complete perspective on that experience. But I still, the other part of my life has been my work in technology and my work in education, and that is really deeply rooted in a belief that, particularly around education, the education of young people is the best hope for the world. It's the best way we're going to make the world better is by developing young people who are capable, ethical, thoughtful, and can approach problems with a humane perspective on how we're going to solve them. So I've always believed in that, and that's what I'm really focused on trying to do.
That's so amazing. Well, another question that I wanted to know was did you know what you wanted to become when you were younger?
No, I started getting into computing in high school. Of course, we didn't really have personal computers or anything then. We had a computer you could dial up that was far away. But I started getting interested in them then, and I got excited very early on and loved working on the technology. So I did that early on and really enjoyed it, and that got me started in the direction that eventually led me to get a PhD.
Wow. So you knew you were interested in something.
Yeah, I was interested in computer science. Now, remember that when I went to school, you couldn't major in computer science as an undergraduate major. It wasn't offered anywhere in the United States. Graduate programs, yes, graduate programs were probably then where graduate programs started in the mid-'60s, roughly. So I did my undergraduate degree is actually in electrical engineering because that was as close as you could get to doing computing at that point. And then I switched from my graduate work to computer science.
Oh, wow. Also, you've achieved so much in life. I was wondering, how do you define success for yourself, and how do you recommend younger students find their own?
Well, for me, success is two parts. One, joy in what I do. So I love the work I do, whether it's been doing research or teaching. I love it. I just love doing it, and I love that experience of being involved in research, discovering something new, or teaching and seeing young people grow and learn new things. So when I combine that with my goal to do something that's good for the world, there's a natural alignment, and that's kind of what I've focused my life on.
That's interesting. Well, in that case, then you've mentioned other than like finding joy in like things like computing or more academically focused things, you've also mentioned your love for traveling and experiencing different cultures. So I was wondering, what do you think is enjoyable about it, and what are the most important lessons that traveling gives you?
Well, I think I just enjoy particularly going to different cultures, seeing things that are really very different than you would see in the U.S., seeing a society that lives very differently. I mean, your home country of Thailand, it's so different. I mean, obviously there are things that are the same everywhere around the world, but there are so many things that are so different in Thailand. And, there's in parts of Asia, I find there's this underlying spiritual sense that's really deeply embedded in the society, whether it's India or Thailand, let's say, or other parts of Southeast Asia. And that's very different than the United States, and a very different feel. And then, of course, there's Thai food on top of all that. So I love to eat food from all around the world, try all different kinds of things. And for me, that's a big part of the enjoyment of traveling.
That's amazing. What are some of your favorite places to go then?
Oh, so, well, my wife and I are big art fans. We've been to Italy probably 30 times. So, and because we're big art fans and big fans of Italian food. But I like to go to different places around the world as well. Going to Mexico or going to Turkey, to Istanbul is really amazing. And going to Greece and the Greek islands, and Egypt. Egypt was one of the most eye-opening trips, because we don't, in the West anyway, we don't know as much about. We know a little bit about Egypt at the very high level, right? Pyramids and the Sphinx, but we really don't understand the depth and the length of their culture. I mean, they had this culture that went on for hundreds of years and thousands of years, and their impact on the rest of the world. You realize when you go to Greece that they copied Egyptian temples in some cases. So there was around the Mediterranean, there was an amazing mixing of various insights and arts and things like that. That's really amazing to see.
Yeah, this reminds me of like going back to our talk about education. By experiencing as many cultures and getting to know as many people as possible, you do get a better sense of how the world works, how people work, and I think it's also a really good thing for like younger kids to like get out and like meet as many people as possible, and hopefully be as wise and fun as Professor Hennessy.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think travel is another way to, just like books are one way to learn, travel is another way to learn.
Definitely. Well, we're at nearly the end of our podcast, and so my final question to you relating to education is, in one of your interviews, you mentioned that education is a lifelong endeavor. And so I was wondering whether there is anything that you are currently curious or learning about.
I'm always trying to learn about new things. Right now, I'm trying to learn some new things about various alternative energy technologies that we might use in the future, whether it's new ways to design nuclear energy or new ways to build battery technologies. I'm interested in what's happening in the whole quantum computing area and whether or not it will be a future for the computing industry. So those are things that I certainly remain interested in. The whole what's happening in medicine is just incredible, and so there's you're always interested. I'm not an expert in the field, but I can appreciate the advances and what's been done and the changes that have occurred and how they could impact our lives for the better.
Well, yeah, thank you so much, Professor Hennessy, for sharing about your stories, and also about like how you've been learning throughout the years, especially now when you're also still learning. That's really inspiring. Yeah, for today, I'm really thankful that you've given us our time, and I'm sure that this podcast and what you've shared today will be of like great use to people, younger children listening at home right now.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.